And with that, we have 3 o'clock. So I'd like to welcome Al Lindseth. He's 22 years of Plains All-American, 30 years in energy space as well, does quite a bit for the space as a whole. And with that, I will hand it off to you, sir, and then we'll do question and answer afterwards.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? So I appreciate you coming. 3 o'clock, day 2. There's beer over there. Don't leave. All right, I heard. But I'm going to talk to you guys about something a little different. I knew that you'd hear in this track a lot about how to make OT programs more effective, a lot about the details around OT versus IT. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I see as a big problem and how these programs fail, which is aligning it with the rest of your cyber program, aligning it with the rest of your risk management program, including operations. A lot of these things fail before they even start for those reasons. And I see that a lot. I operate a lot at the board level, at the leadership level, and then kind of work down, work up from the bottom and work down from the top. So a little bit of background on myself. Yeah, I was with Plains All-American. I wore a couple different hats there. I was the chief risk officer. I also owned all the tech. So I had the CIO and the CISO hats. And then kind of played a little bit of an innovation officer the last couple of years. We were going through a lot of change, and I brought in one of our big affiliates, CIOs, kind of put them in the traditional CIO place, allowed me to get out of the weeds and start to work with the different business groups on real transformation. So for example, if you're, we had a lot of operations in Canada and we had a lot of operations in the US, there's pipelines in the US, different assets, plants in Canada. If you're consolidating Maximo, you got 2 30-year operations guys that don't like to do things differently from the way they like, that you have to align around different assets, different ways of doing things, and modernize. So it's a tough task, and it takes a senior level person. So I was kind of doing that. So I'll tell you a little bit about Plains, why that's applicable. So Plains had a $180 million rogue trading loss, like in 1997, 98 time period. Got splashed all over the headlines. They were a small company, and they really had just grown so fast. And I got involved with them because I was a risk consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers. And then when I came in, I was like, you guys don't even know what you're sitting on here. This could be a great company with the mixture of assets. And they needed to resume growth, so I kind of took the fix-it person's role and jumped around. Their accounting was all messed up. They were trying to run pipelines out of spreadsheets, a lot of things. And I ended up with risk and technology, and I stayed there for 22 years. That was also at a time when Enron, the whole trading debacle was happening, post-Enron, right about Sarbanes-Oxley. So Plains really was successful. We grew, we had 12 straight years of meeting or beating earnings guidance and double-digit growth, and it got a lot of attention because of our risk management, asset optimization strategies, which were real low risk and not trading necessarily, more optimization. And so I was put in front, and I used to speak to all Houston CFOs about risk management once a year. We had kind of, Advanta events. We had those for other functions. And I got a lot of attention from boards and leadership teams, and that flowed over to IT and cyber, because that's really when cyber programs were starting to develop. So a lot of board members and other companies, a lot of leadership teams, a lot of my peers started pulling me into a lot more collaboration and speaking around cyber. So I've really kind of been doing this for decades, and seeing the perspective of the board and seeing the perspective of my peers and where they mismatch. And so that's where a lot of these observations come from, and then working with the teams. So because I was chief risk officer, I always like to start with business risk. Okay, it's a lot easier to have a discussion around cyber if you start with business risk and then link it to technology and cyber, in my opinion, because this is really top of mind to boards and leadership teams. And this chart here shows why. It's because in 1970, the average tenure of a Fortune 500 company was 40 years. And now it's more like 10 to 12. All right, it's even worse for smaller companies. 3/4 of small companies are expected to be around in a decade. So there's a lot of risk, and an interesting phenomenon has happened in the last handful of years where technological advances have risen to the top of those reasons for failure. And, so boards that used to not take technology seriously really can't do that anymore if they're looking at the hard data. And I like the way that the author of this book, Goliath's Revenge, illustrates what's happening. You had this situation around 2020, before COVID, where a lot of elements were set up for tech to really take off, for applications to take off, cloud, big data, infrastructure as a service, and it did. And what the author says is before you had kind of a probability distribution curve, and for a lot of different reasons, you wanted to be on the right side of that, up in the third quartile or solidly in the fourth quartile. It could be for a number of different reasons. In this post-digital age, he said you got a small group of companies that are developing the right capabilities to upset their competition, to disrupt their competition, to succeed against more sophisticated attackers, those types of things. It's a small group, and everybody else in the middle is moving to the left. And so you get the digital haves and digital have-nots. And I see this all the time. Now, so I've been advising for the last 3.5 years. I left Plains after a 22-year career. So I do a lot of small engagement where I'll jump in and meet with one company and then go meet with another company. And so I still see a lot of this. And nowhere is that gap bigger than in OT programs. In OT programs, there's a massive differentiation between the digital haves and the digital have-nots. And so let me talk a little bit about what I see the digital have-nots doing, and I see this all the time. There's a lot of optics out there where companies are making it look like they're really moving along, and then when you get behind the scenes, things like this are happening. Gathering asset data with little context, So let me see a show of hands. How many people have organizations where you see the spreadsheets go out to the field and the operations and the factory floor, all this stuff comes back, nothing ever happens with it. And then, it happens again in 3 years and nothing's happened to it. And you get operations that just gets a lot of apathy over time. They don't want to participate in those things anymore because nothing's happening with it. You don't have to show a show of hands, actually. I see all the time these 3-year plans, 2-year plans to get around and audit all the plants, all the different operations. And they know that one that they're not going to get to for 6 months has flat networks. Nobody understands anything about the equipment that's there, but they don't do anything about it past, normal hygiene until the audit team gets there. And they're going around all these assets and really building up legacy because a lot of them are just segmenting. They're kind of using antiquated methods. And I always tell them, you're going to turn around in 3 years or so, and you're going to have built up a lot of legacy, and you're going to be using obsolete techniques. And I see that all the time. I see regulatory leading all this, and I see a lot of pressures get put on the CISOs and the CIOs, and not on the heads of operations, who a lot of the OT personnel report to. I see a lot of OT and IT teams at cross purposes. And I see a lot of approaches being executed that work better for IT, and I'm going to talk about that a decent amount without taking into account the OT. I see a lot of companies right now trying to get the operating data to use for analytics and AI. And they don't have the right controls in place for AI or OT. And so they're really flying blind in a lot of these cases. So, I probably 7 out of 10 companies I go in and talk to, this is what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about what you kind of have to do to integrate these programs in at the leadership level. First, you got to kind of know who owns it. Who owns technology, who owns cyber, and who owns OT. And so we wanted our full board to own technology. They kind of assumed that the audit committee would own it. That's how most boards are, very strategic. They think it's more controls oriented, so the audit committee owns it. And so you have to really kind of champion it for the audit committee and onboard the whole board. So I used to have a cyber scorecard quarterly report where we would have the responsibilities of the full board, a slide on that, and then my quarterly report. For years, we put in front of them, you guys are responsible for this. And the audit committee appreciated that, right? But when OT came along, there are all sorts of other ownership issues, right? In terms of how IT and cyber work with operations. If there's a disagreement between the two, the operations people have a lot of pull at the board level. Luckily, I had risk management, so I had kind of business responsibilities, and we'd had a big success there, so I had a lot of pull too, but a lot of CISOs and CIOs aren't in that situation. So you have to see how the board deals with how different risks interact and kind of align with that. You can't come in and make it all about cyber. And so I had owned risk management, so we actually built the reporting similar to how we had the risk management reporting. So we used to have a big risk report that would go out daily and had a lot of detail in it, but at the top, there were 5 questions. Things like, have we had a violation of our trading policies, things like that. And the CEO said he liked to look down at his BlackBerry, because that's what we had at the time, and see 5 nones. None to every was the answer to every question. He called it his convent, right? He was a pretty colorful guy. So I built the cyber reports, same way, right? And it helped. It helped with the management team. It helped with the board, because we really spoke that language of risk. It was very important to us, to our culture. We'd come back. It'd been a great turnaround. So I leveraged off of that. So you have to kind of figure out how the stuff aligns. I had a little bit of an advantage because I owned risk management. What I coach a lot of my CISO clients is if you're a public company, you have an annual reporting process, kind of a what keeps you up at night, risk assessment that happens at the board and the leadership level. Go find, and MD&A is created by that. Strategic plans, operational plans are created by that. All public companies have it, and a lot of non-public companies have it as well for their strategic planning process. I say go find who owns that. Is it a compliance officer? Is it the risk officer? And partner up with them. Kind of learn how the board is treating these different risks on their agenda, and teach them too how you want to kind of use it for cyber, and then partner with that. And then also when it comes to outcomes, desired outcomes and goals, you see this big clash from a regulatory versus risk perspective. That's a big deal. I give a whole other talk on that. And when companies come in and they let the regulatory compliance drive it, thinking that could be a budget hook, that could, help get attention and momentum, that can often backfire. So like in midstream, you've got this framework called operational management system that drives a lot of what happens with operations. They put big teams together around it. They have strategic plans around, increasing the maturity and their score essentially in that framework. They audit those results, and cyber was never integrated into that. So immediately, you're not integrated into a lot of efforts that drive their goals on a daily basis. And so you have to figure out how to integrate with that. Like the head of operations should be working with the CISO to integrate that in when it comes to OT programs. And, but it was a big issue on how to do that. And so that's something that is very, very important. I practice a top-down risk, bottom-up compliance perspective. I think risk should always own the process, but you have to figure out what are the must-haves. What are the critical aspects? What are the minimum standards? You have to comply with those. But everything else is a trade-off. Like when the Colonial incident happened and Security Directive 1 came out from the TSA, there were a lot of recommended measures that were very antiquated. And so, we really had to get a lot of support to come up with alternative methods and get the TSA on board with that. And we were the 3rd or 4th company that was inspected by them. So you have to kind of figure out, normally operations would just say yes. PHMSA comes in and says you have to do something. They just are trying to figure out a way to say yes, not to say we don't agree with you. Now we want to provide you a lot of detail on what our alternative methods should be. That was not something that was normally a reaction to these kind of programs. So you have to kind of look at these. And I think you have to approach OT as a problem with your boards and leadership teams. It can't just be an extension of your cyber program. And the main way to frame it as a problem is say, all this stuff, these systems don't have cyber built in. They never did. They've been around for a long time. They also, though, have a different risk profile that lowers the risk, the segmentation and the farther away they are from the business networks, the segmented access control layers that are inherent in them, the resiliency that's built in, safety systems. But what's changed? What's changed is that we're modernizing these systems. What's changed is that the attackers are focusing on them. What's changed is that we're getting a lot more convergence. We need a lot more operating data. There's a lot of potential revenue and money associated with that. So, all this has changed, but there was a good reason why the whole strategy was isolation around a lot of these systems until about 8-9 years ago. Inertia is a big issue with these programs. Just groups not wanting to move along or getting frozen by the complexity. And so I see CISOs approach it in an alarmist way sometimes, which I think is not the best way to go, but also sometimes approach it in a way where they end up being a pushover. A good example of that is leading with the regulatory frameworks. I love NIST. I'm a huge fan of NIST. I'm saying include it in the deck, do the analysis, but don't lead with it. I've gotten the perception a lot of times from the boards when people do this, and their perception, because they're a very strategic group, is somebody's coming at us with a one-size-fits-all solution as opposed to talking to us about our risks. This person wants to fill gaps. And that often is how they perceive it. You have to know your audience. Board leadership team, they're a very strategic group. They think in terms of trends, trajectories, direction, and the pace of change, and they'll establish a market view, based on that. What's this going to look like in a year? What's this going to look like in 2 years? And they divest or buy companies based on their market view. They go long or short based on their market view. So my approach was to do that, and that's a lot of what I coach. Break it up into meaningful aspects, show the pace of change, and the whole goal of that is to establish a change imperative. You want people to feel like they have to do something. OT, it was a little challenging years ago because you hadn't had a lot of environmental or safety issues in the U.S. You could always point at the Ukraine, up to about 8-9 years ago, a decade ago, because we had the Russians in here. They just hadn't pulled the trigger. So you could show what would happen with a motivated attack, but you didn't have a lot of those. From a regulatory standpoint, there was kind of a trusting environment, and there still is in a lot of areas like manufacturing and stuff, but it certainly changed in midstream with the Colonial incident. And then a lot of these systems weren't changing, so there was kind of, if the systems aren't changing, it's tougher to get people to feel like, there's a big pace of change. This isn't the case anymore. Okay, this is all moving dramatically. I don't know, and fast. And I don't know how many of you sat in the gentleman's keynote opener yesterday, about Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon and, all the signals that are happening around the Chinese. But this is happening, and they've said they're going to attack in 2027. And when they do, just to flex their muscles, the lights are going to go out in a lot of places over here. So this is very real. And luckily, companies are taking it a little more seriously. But the first step that a lot of people miss is you got to get them to feel like they've got to do something. Really feel it. But they're not going to do something if they can't tie it into their goals in a simple, clean way. So I always use the defense in depth. A lot of this is about storytelling. It's a great mechanism to use. The goals don't get any simpler than defense in depth. You're trying to prevent an attack, detect it as quickly as possible, respond effectively, and get ahead of it or predict it. Right? And I would take the history of IT cyber and just boil it down in Cliff Notes for a lot of these guys. Like decades ago, it was about keeping the bad guys out, the wall, the moat around the castle. Then they started to get more sophisticated. You had to detect them, differentiate false positives from a real indicator of compromise. Then you had the foreign nationals come into play, and it was a matter of when, not if. All programs were built around. So resiliency became more important, response, recovery. Now a lot of it's about getting ahead of these attacks. And you could kind of, in the IT cyber world, you could kind of layer on tools to address a lot of this. You had to do it in a sophisticated way with a long-term view, so you didn't end up with a lot of things that didn't talk to each other, but you could kind of do that. OT was a little different. OT, the whole strategy was prevention and isolation until black energy in the Ukraine. And I'm sure you guys have heard the story. Our government went over there, came back, said that can't happen here. And a lot of people in the know said it absolutely can happen here because we don't have visibility into these systems because that's not really been the strategy. People like Rob Lee and others really made that apparent. And so then, and that was probably 8, 9 years ago, you had this real big push, to kind of move to detection and response and resiliency. But a lot of companies have approached this with the defense in depth model that was in place, which is a lot more suited for IT. And it's been a real struggle that they've done that because defense in depth is different for OT than IT. And these are just some reasons. I won't get into detail because you guys have heard a lot about that today. But, and prevent, firewalls and patching, you can't patch them, flat networks, detection, the visibility's fragmented in OT, there's a lot of proprietary protocols, response, you can't just shut things down, you get safety and production risk, prediction, a lot of the data is incomplete, there's untrusted data, you run into a lot of other issues. So, companies have kind of over time tried to do a lot of this. They've run into walls. The innovation and the tech hasn't quite been there because the market hasn't been there, because companies haven't been as innovative around OT. They haven't been big buyers of some of the emerging tech. And then they've tried a lot of these alternative approaches that are on the right that don't quite work for it either. Now that's changed in the last couple of years. That's why I'm kind of coming back out around OT. When I moved into my advisory about 3.5 years ago, I was heavily involved with critical infrastructure at Plains, policy. I used to go up to Washington. I was board of the ISAC. I led a big National Petroleum Council study on OT with all the midstream companies involved. But when I came out, I was very focused on it. Companies weren't being innovative. They were still running around doing all that stuff that the digital have-nots do. We've seen that change in about the last year or so, led by the majors, and programs are getting a lot more sophisticated, but for the digital haves, not for the majority. And, so you have to really kind of understand the nuances. Another big thing that gets missed a lot with CISOs is you have to get a seat at the table before. It doesn't matter how well you know cybersecurity or IT. The first step is to get some credibility around your business knowledge and with people like board members that are really good in business. They're the oversight to your management team. They come from operational backgrounds, finance backgrounds. You have to be able to impress them with your business knowledge, and particularly in OT, because they expect in OT it to be led by the business risk. So the first step I tell a lot of my clients is, how well do you know the business? There's a lot of information at their fingertips that they can use. Operational audit plans, business impact assessments. A lot of what internal audit does is based on the highest perceived risks in the company from the management team, and then they go out and they do all this work and they document it in a way that's easy to understand. And there's years of that somebody can go back and look at. And when you go through drills, you end up with a lot of little nuggets that you can use to increase this credibility on the business side that board members wouldn't know. So things like how long could we operate manually our pipelines? They're not going to know the answer to that, but you might have figured that out when you go through these exercises and drills. So it takes a little bit of a deliberate effort to get a seat at the table. And what I find time and time again is when people don't go through that first step and they come in thinking, I know cyber the best, I know technology the best, they really fall flat. So you have to kind of get a seat at the table, put some effort into that, do some homework. And then once you do, you are an asset to them. There's a lot of pressure on the board right now to develop more competencies around technology and cyber, and they do not know this stuff, and you do. So if you get past that first step, then you get pulled in, and they view you as an asset. Next thing you know, they're talking to you about their home networks, how they can protect their children, all sorts of stuff. Other companies that they're on boards with that got hacked, and these conversations are great. It's because they're interested, they want to learn, and then you can leverage off of that. But that first step is really, really important, and particularly in OT, sometimes you can get into some tension, right, with the ops people. So if you're going out and you're saying we want to roll out this system to get more visibility into the plants, that's probably going to be well received in some cases where you've got a regulatory structure where there's a huge risk downtime. But like what I see a lot is in these areas like water or upstream or other, that where there's not as much of a hook there. The people at the plant could say, or the people, you know, in the upstream at the rig can say, you know, that we deal with downtime all the time, or like if it's downtime on a compressor station or resiliency, and stop it, you know, and then they escalate it up to the operations people who have a lot of credibility at the leadership team and the board level, and then now you're at odds with them a little bit, and I see all sorts of CISOs lose that battle. And so a lot of the time it becomes a business discussion when you're trying to convince them to move forward with these exercises, you know, where you can say, you know what, okay, I get one compressor's down, you guys deal with that stuff all the time, or maybe the pipeline still makes nominations. But here's how a cyber attack would look. You know, what if there's 3 down? What if you're targeted? What if the HMI data is bad? What if, you know, I mean, there's all these different scenarios where you can say, what would you guys do in the event of a compressor down? And then they tell you, and then you go, okay, well, let's add on to that. This is how these things operate. You can come in with some examples. What I see time and time again is somebody come in with Colonial, or, you know, not Petya, in these extreme examples, and they're talking about, you know, rolling out a program to upstream rigs or something like that. It's just not applicable. It looks alarmist. And so having that business discussion, educating them on what that could look like, that is 90% of business discussion. So understanding the business is really, really important. I wanted to have a model where I could just say, hey, here's our risk, right? Because I own the enterprise, I already owned it, so I had kind of an advantage to be able to link it to cyber. And I did that pretty well with IT, and we had a scorecard that I thought had all the most important things, the board on it. And then OT came along. It's very difficult to quantify risk in OT, you know, across the board. And so, you know, I kind of use this model: gross financial risks, threats, consequences, vulnerabilities, and then if you include insurance, cyber insurance, something like that, you get net financial risk, right? And so what a lot of companies do, and what I did, is you kind of break it apart, you know. So for like threats, if there were an OT threat out there, I was the first one to jump on it. Really any threats that were in the paper, and show them, hey, here's how this, okay, it doesn't impact us, or maybe here's some of the stuff that we did to make certain that it doesn't impact us. We looked at indicators of compromise, and we're clean. We still had lessons learned because we kind of thought about a drill on what would impact us. Like I would have been doing that with after the SEC rules came out, you know, with some of the casino issues in Vegas, for example. You know, it doesn't have to fully affect you. And I would do that with OT incidents, just so they could see what sort of threat intel do we use? How do we get the most out of threat intel? A lot more than somebody else, right? And then the consequence. I would always talk about the drills that we had. I would use examples. I would let them know, you know, we know how much it costs if, you know, our big terminals are down, or plants in Canada, or if our pipeline's down, how long we can run, still make nominations. You know, that became kind of important, not only around risk, but, you know, supply chain and other areas. And then, but vulnerability was very difficult. Vulnerability, as defined here, is likelihood percentage of damage. So you're taking into account your existing risk mitigants. That's really your scorecard, or whatever you're bringing back up. And you have different levels of reporting at the board level, you know, at the management level, at the team level, in terms of net exposure. Very difficult to do that in OT. I don't know how many of you have tried to, like, you know, you can't just say, here's a vulnerability management, you know, program or dashboard or anything. So it became really kind of difficult to do that in OT. So you have to really think about meaningful measures, and a lot of times link them to operational outcomes. And some of that is storytelling. Now, I will tell you, the innovation over the last couple of years, it's gotten a lot easier to do this across the level, between the transparency that some of the systems and programs allow, and then your ability to, you know, control and measure access in a way where you can protect things and link it to identity and do a lot of other things. MFA, just-in-time MFA. So this has become a lot easier in the last couple of years with the innovation that's out there, but it's really just been the last couple of years. And what I see a lot is this false sense of we're air-gapped, and when that causes someone to not develop the right capabilities, then that is a big issue, because nobody's air-gapped. All these systems need to be maintained. And the more they're modernized, the more companies are using them to connect. If you're not developing your asset inventories, if you're not developing better ways to allow access into these systems for things to be done within them using sophisticated modern methods, well then you really are just you have a false sense of security around this. And when you look at risk mitigation, so risk mitigation kind of involves a assessment process where you're asking yourself a lot of different questions. First starting with what's the exposure, what's the impact, what's the vulnerability, what's the probability of something happening, what are the threats, and then what types of controls do we have in place? Are they detective? Are they preventive? So it's a pretty tedious process that you go through, but as you go through that, you basically have these 6 outcomes with all risk mitigation options. You can avoid the risk, you can transfer the risk, like through cyber insurance, or contractually, you can limit it, you can do risk planning, you can acknowledge the risk, continue to research, you can do risk assumption, easy breezy, right? Not so much in OT. Risk avoidance becomes prohibitively expensive. You're talking about equipment upgrades, things that cost a lot of money outside of like normal hygiene. Right? Risk transference doesn't really, contractually with the vendors, maybe you're able to do something, but it's probably only going to be on their most current versions of their systems, not everything that's out there, even if you're able to make that happen. Risk limitation, you can't just roll out patches, you're really thinking through upgrades, downtime, how often we do assessments. So where most companies have ended up is kind of in the last 2, risk acknowledgement and research. A lot of that digital have-not activity, gathering a lot of information, not really doing a lot with it. Or risk assumption. The problem is a lot of them don't know what risks that they're assuming, right? When they get out there, they see all these things, direct connections to the internet or old systems, obsolete windows, plain text passwords. See it time and time again. Really what I always coach companies to do is maybe you're not going to do these risk avoidance actions as much, right? Because they cost a lot of money, their equipment upgrade, things like that. You're going to do all the hygiene, everybody does that. You're going to continue to segment, but at the same time, you need to be building out the visibility. And I always tell them, because if a vulnerability that's related to OT comes up, you need to be able to map it to what you have. If you don't know what you have, you can't do that. So visibility's always been really important. The problem with that is it costs money, and you roll out and you get into this never-ending, okay, now we got to get down to a component level, and and it can get pushed back, and it can kind of get a little stale sometimes. You really have to kind of mix that in with better identity-based access. And like I said, now with a lot of the modern innovation that's out there, you can do that. And that has a little bit more compelling ROI, but that doesn't mean that you need to skip the visibility. So you can kind of manage these 2 things and continue to roll out the visibility, but at the same time, be able to control access and get MFA around devices that are tough to get, and have things, have that go down to an access level or different nodes. And it's a little bit better balance, but a lot of companies don't know about the innovation that's out there, honestly, and so they're not doing it. But it has kind of changed the game here in the last couple of years. The other things that has changed is attackers are focused on OT, obviously, right? And defenses have been slow. So we're getting attacked every day. When you get into operations, they have a risk formula, that they kind of use to plot what they're going to do. And in pipeline, it was around, potential of leaks or spills, or a lot of that has to do more with material analysis, or with smart pigs or things like, or there's in plants, there's process risk, so there are all these frameworks. And in a lot of cases, you can leverage off those frameworks where they haven't changed as much on the consequence side. So if you're like doing a drill with your operations group, a lot of the consequences of a cyber attack are going to be pretty similar to what they're already drilling: spills, fires, things like that. It's more on the threat side, where you look at, it could be a lot more dynamic than what you're used to. It could be a motivated attacker. We could get targeted. And if you look at this risk formula, you can create a lot of really interesting exercises that bring these groups together based on that. You can kind of keep everybody in their lane and have cyber injection threat attacks, but understanding the drill that they already did that had a lot of those types of consequences, they can stay in their lane. And once you have a successful drill, that's usually a pretty good thing to then try to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take that success and those lessons learned, and we're going to look at third-party access, or we're going to look at high-risk assets that we have in that plant. And you can kind of create the starting of a program after a successful drill in a lot of cases. Like Idaho National Labs does a lot of that. If you guys have had exposure to their consequence-driven approaches, which are great. The ROI that we're looking at is massive here. You can see a lot more insider attacks in all this. If there's a room full of people out there with a foreign national that are trying to get into your organization, they're going to get in, even if they have to offer an insider $1 million, or somebody that works remotely, which they will. So they're going to figure it out. If you're an easier target, if you're just checking the regulatory boxes, attackers love companies that do that. And really, the deck's stacked against you. It just takes one bad click. The other thing that's really important that I find around a lot of these programs is that you have to understand that they are big transformational initiatives. There's a lot of change involved. There's a lot of change leadership that's needed. This often gets missed. Okay, so I work a lot on digital transformation efforts, and I speak a lot on it, and I regard OT programs as transformational efforts. I think that you have to, but 90% of companies have these efforts. They get that they're important. We're going through a lot of change. They're spending trillions of dollars on it. A lot of things aren't captured in those numbers, like OT program rollouts. And a lot of these management teams think that they're already really good at managing change. If you take oil and gas, for instance, the whole flow has changed, has switched, completely with oil and gas. It used to flow, into kind of the mid-continent, right? And imports would come in, and now it goes the exact opposite way, and we're exporters. So these companies that have kind of been able to survive, if you try to act like they're not good at change, they're going to toss you out on your head. They're very, very good at change, but they're not good at digital change. I've seen it time and time again, these management meetings, we sit around and it's like a selection process to them. We're going to select the right vendor, we're going to select the right platform, we're going to select the right project manager, hit the easy button, and everything's going to be successful. And modern tech just doesn't work that way. It's more about looking under the rocks and thinking about what have we not done well. How have we failed our customers? What projects have we had going on for years that we haven't made headway? It's very humbling. It's like therapy in a lot of these cases. And a lot of these groups, they don't want to approach it that way. So they end up failing. And so that change leadership takes a lot of different skill sets, people skill sets, process skill sets, not only the technology, risk skill sets. And this often gets overlooked. So what I do, a lot of times, if it's an existing effort, I'll come in, and over years and years, I built up a list of these are the reasons why I think these things go wrong, and I will measure up their existing effort against that. And in a matter of hours, time and time again, I can move along stuff that's been dragging for years. And it's not because I'm so good. It does take some skill sets and some techniques and some experience in certain areas. It's more because this is all low-hanging fruit that they're just ignoring, basically. Like, this is easy stuff. I came in as a risk manager into technology, and a risk manager, they form a list of objectively what are the biggest risks, and they hit the ones at the top. If you don't hit the ones at the top, you're looking at being over limits or a big trading loss or anything. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable the stuff at the top is. It's often leadership and behaviors when it comes to these OT programs. So what I see these teams do is they avoid that. Like, like the plague. They don't want to do that. And I used to tell them, you're not going to win any popularity contests, but you're not going to get fired. What's going to get you fired is overlooking that and having an operational issue or a hack or downtime in a plant because we didn't address those things. How are you going to explain that later? And I see time and time again this just get missed, overlooked. Nobody wants to address it. I'll come in and address it in the room. I had a meeting a while back where, they said, that was the best meeting we've ever had. This thing's moving along, but I got bad news for you. You're not invited back because you really pissed off the CEO. And I was like, you know what? That's a win. Because he was just sitting there acting like a digital have-not. He was obviously the problem. And I said, hey, you know what? 85% of companies are going to be digital have-nots. That's great, and kind of laughed and diffused it and danced a little bit. But he was looking at me like, nobody talks to me that way. But, once they know things in the room and it's been exposed, they can't unexpose that, and so they change their own behaviors. So, it's uncomfortable. Change is uncomfortable. People don't want to deal with the uncomfortable. Failure to recognize and manage non-technology factors. They leapfrog over this stuff, put all the pressure on the CIO and the CISO. And it's very easy to come back and look at their efforts and go, how long has this been going on? This initial timeline said it was supposed to take 6 months. After the TSA stuff, it was like a whole laundry list of IT projects. And you can just go back and say, why is this taking so long? What are the upstream dependencies? And if they won't tell you, somebody else will. And it's all non-tech stuff. The teams aren't getting along, stuff like that. And so it's real easy to see where that's happening. They approach it like an IT project. That's one of the biggest killers. Because when people are threatened by change, they focus on their differences. What's the first thing an IT project manager is going to do? Create these big discovery workshops and pull everybody in. And these meetings where they focus on their differences can just sabotage the whole thing. And then next thing you know, you got a 2-year effort that was just doomed from the outset because of how it started. You have to recognize who's going to resist this stuff, and you have to be more stealthy. There's a lot of different techniques you can use. A lot of companies will move because they want it to move, but they're not really bringing along everybody in that process with them, and it ends up failing. They're not focusing on the outcomes. It's interesting because AI has kind of changed that a little bit. That was very applicable for cloud. It's very applicable for OT, where you kind of had to have this stuff mapped out. AI, one group can move along and get value out of it. The other groups don't necessarily have to, and not identifying the right techniques to use is really, really important. Standardization, optimization is really key. And so you kind of have to think about, is it transformational? And if it's transformational, everything there is political, because you're threatening these boundaries where people get significance and security and their sense of identity. And there's a small subset of the population that will fight to retain that, keep things the way that they are. And so you have to kind of understand this measure of personal risk that gets involved in a lot of this. And there are a lot of techniques that you can use that I don't really have time to go through right now. But one of them, is kind of just simply putting, the list of tasks, the balance of work out there so that people can see it. Like right here, OT cyber, I've got kind of the OT cyber stuff. And what I'm illustrating right here within this one company, I use this, is that here's all the stuff IT cyber does. Let's look at OT cyber, and I was telling the head of operations, these are resources that report to you. And a lot of this, they're in charge of a lot of this work. It's not IT cyber, and you got all this pressure on IT cyber over here, and you're really working on all this stuff with your vendors, your OT vendors. Like IT does not have pull or influence in this area. They need your help to move this along. And just having everybody see that and understand it was really important. So if you kind of envision, these are just a lot of different reasons. If you're in a room and you got the whole management team there and you're asking these questions around an existing effort and going through and getting them to understand why they're failing, it's really enlightening because they can do a lot around these things without a big project or spending tons of money. They're very, very correctable. They just have to kind of manage themselves a little bit. And you guys have been hearing all day about what it takes, within these OT programs to be successful. So I won't belabor this. I'll just kind of leave it up and take any questions.
Questions.
No questions? You guys are ready for beer? Oh, we got one.
There's a lot of material, and this is kind of like a wish list, right? Because you can't, as far as I'm understanding, this is all great, by the way. I really like your slides. There are a lot of activities that have to happen in order to get consensus. But when you approach this, how much of it is learning and expressing what's really going on, and how much of it is politics and money? And do you scale that over time rather than, I mean, because nobody really ever has money for this.
So a lot of this, you can actually move these things along in a very short amount of time, has been my experience. Because some of it's education and storytelling and setting things up so that when you show them what they're doing, it's very obvious. And then you leave and let them handle it in a lot of cases. So a lot of it is politics, leadership issues, in my experience, that you see, but they don't even necessarily know that they're doing it because you haven't presented it that way. Nobody's presented it that way to them. So once you do that, in a lot of cases, and some people will get defensive. You have to this is a problem with a lot of the big consulting firms, is they come in, they got a lot at stake. They can't ruffle feathers because they got a bunch of people there, and the partner's under a lot of pressure. But if you're willing to come in there and ruffle feathers and just be like, you're the problem, it's amazing how quickly it moves along.
So then you don't really I mean, what do you do? Just do a check-in in like 2 months or something?
Yeah.
Like you give them like a gap list or something? If
they want, I got consulting partners. They do like the heavy lifting. I come in and do short leadership-focused engagements and provide guidance, advisory to the consulting partners. I'm operating at that level. Yeah, in a lot of cases, you let them kind of run with it. If they're willing, then you keep coming back. Like if they're open to it. If sometimes they have to kind of, once you've exposed it, it's kind of like therapy at the leadership level, then they have to kind of figure things out themselves, and they have to have a little bit of soak time. What drives me nuts is that this stuff is happening, and it's going to have real impact, and it doesn't have to.
Well, I talked to a tech more recently, and he told me, oh yeah, I could set that up the way I used to do it when I was in a bigger company. So yeah, I could do that. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah.
And I was like, yes, like you're open to attack. And he says, oh, I could fix it. I could put, and he was telling me, and I'm like, oh, why didn't you already do that?
I mean, at the line level, the ops people are just trying to get their job done, and somebody said earlier they don't want to be woken up at 2:00, and so there's a lot of none of it's us against them. I mean, I find that when you clear this stuff at a leadership level and you can work down, everybody's trying to get to the same place. And you just have to kind of educate and work it between those groups. But it's not rocket science, honestly. And the big complexity with OT programs has been the tools that we have available, the complexity at that level, and that's getting a lot better now too, which enables a lot of these companies to move forward. They have a lot more options, like in the last 2 years. I think that's a huge enabler, but this stuff I don't think is rocket science. I mean, it really isn't. It's very solvable. Internally, companies can solve this. They just got to be willing to address it.
Thank you, Al, very much. That was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
That concludes the OT SecCon track. The next step, I guess, is for if you want to attend the keynote, which will have a spy, so it could be interesting. So go and check that out, and stick around for the closing remarks as well. That's when they'll do, if you did the stamps, they'll have the giveaway for that as well. But I want to thank everybody for participating, and thank you for your time and coming. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you, Al.